All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College EWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been going through a series of videos, or I'm creating a series of videos that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm on the CSS portion and in this building blocks module, and I'm talking about the box model. Now, previously we talked about the box model, all right, and now we're going to actually see some examples of using the box model. All right, so it says in the example below you see two boxes. Both have a class of box, which gives them the same width, the same height, the same, etc. The only difference is the second box has been set to use the alternative box model. It says, can you change the size of the second box by adding CSS to make it match the first one in height? Well, let's look at it. So since the second one used box sizing border box, that means that it has everything that you see in here. In other words, the border is 5 pixels, background color, the padding that's in here, this padding is 40 pixels. There's a margin here of 40 pixels. This width is 300 pixels, and this height is 150 pixels. So what's different here? Well, when you look here, this one, since we had the margin of 40 pixels, we've got to be able to account for that. All right. And let's see what they say. Find a solution for it here. So in order to do this, for the alternate one, we had to change the width from 350 pixels to 390 pixels, and we had to change the height from whatever it was, 150 or whatever, to 240 pixels. So bottom line is this. When you don't use box sizing border box, when you do not use it, every time that you add either margin or you add padding, it gets basically factored into the size of the element. And when you use the box sizing border box, basically it does not. All right. Hopefully I'm making this easier to understand and not harder. Use browser dev tools to view the box model. Well, you can do that at any time. For instance, let's just bring up the one that we had here before. Where is it? I'm going to close a few of these things that I don't need anymore. But let's look at this one. All right. So if I right mouse click here and I choose inspect and I take a look what it's showing me here. The one that's here that says the block is styled. Notice what it is. It's showing me the amount of padding. It's showing me the border. It's showing me the margin. So it's showing me the whole setup for this. Now I can go through, and there's ways that you can go through and look at this in a little more depth and breadth of coverage. But the thing that's nice about it is it's showing you the way that it's laid out. And it's saying that right now, this is 211.5 pixels, I believe, wide and 139.5 pixels tall. So that's your content. There's the padding that's around it. There's the border that's around that. And there's the margin that's around the border. Now, we've talked a little bit about margin before, but as it says, the margin is the invisible space around your box. It pushes other elements from the box. So in other words, It's basically the distance that you're putting in between elements. Now notice on here that margins can have negative values. Sometimes, especially when you start to use things like animations, types of things using CSS, you might start out with a negative margin. So something basically works its way into the field of view, all right, as opposed to being there from the start. Setting a negative margin on one side can cause it to overlap other things on the page. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Whether you are using the standard or alternative box model, a margin is always added after the size of the box has been calculated. We can control all margins by using the margin property. So you can either do them separately or together. And as I've mentioned to you, it's like a clock. Top 12 o'clock, right 3 o'clock, bottom 6 o'clock, left 9 o'clock. So again, there's nothing wrong with setting it up like this, but this could have just said, if we wanted to, margin, negative 40px space, 30px space, 40px space, 4em type of thing would have been fine as well. It says there, a key thing to understand about margins is the concept of margin collapsing. If you have two elements whose margins touch, and both are positive, they combine into one margin, and they take the size of the largest one. So in other words, let's look at this example. Let's assume here that this has a bottom margin of 50 pixels, and this has a top margin of 30 pixels. What will happen is you won't get 80 pixels. It'll come in and just take the biggest one, which is 50 pixels, and that's the one that'll be used. It'll collapse into that. Okay. There are a number of rules, as it says, that dictate when margins do and do not collapse. And as always, they provide a very helpful link so you can look at this in more depth and breadth of coverage. Borders, as it says, a border is drawn between the margin and the padding. So it basically, what the border does is it helps you distinguish what is inside of the box, the entire thing that's holding the content, and what's outside of it. All right, it says if you're using the standard box model, the size of the border is added to the width and height. If you're using the alternative, the display border box, then the size of the border makes the content box smaller as it takes up some of the available width and height. All right, now borders also work where you can do top left, bottom, top right, bottom left, very similar to what I mentioned to you before, like a clock. And there's different ways that, when you set up the border, you can set a width, typically done in pixels. You can set a style, so there's, typically solid is what you use, but there's dashed and there's dotted and a lot of other ones that you can use, and a color. All right, it says to set this, you can use any of these. So why does this matter? Well, when you start to think about a border, there's really, what it really is 4 borders. It's a top border, it's a right border, it's a bottom border, and it's a left border. So if you just specify border, you get all 4. But you can specify bottom top or border top, and or border right, and or border bottom, and or border left. Now, if you're going to be writing a rectangular border around something, don't list all 4 of them. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. All right. But if you only want a partial border, that's something that you might want to consider then. There's an example of a dashed border. There's a double line border, for example. All right, padding. As it says, padding sits between the border and your content area. So it's the amount of blank area, space, whatever you want to call it, all right, between your content and, it surrounds the content. Notice that unlike margins, you can't have a negative padding. So it's got to be 0 or more. Just like with margins, there's padding top, 12 o'clock, padding right, 3 o'clock, padding bottom, 6 o'clock, padding left, 9 o'clock. Okay. All right. The box model and inline boxes. It says all of the above applies fully to block boxes. Some of the properties can apply to inline boxes, such as those created by a span. So notice what we have here. In this example, we've got a span inside of a paragraph, and we've applied height, width, margin, border, and padding. And it says you can see that the width and the height are ignored. The vertical margin, padding, and border are respected, but they do not change the relationship of the other content. So this can get really hinky when you're using the box model with inline boxes. And the best thing I can tell you about this is sometimes the best way to learn it is to just set up a simple example and play with it. All right. Using display inline block. I wanted to see what we had left in here. That's about it. Says there is a special value of display which provides a middle ground. So using display inline block is sort of a combination of both inline and block. And it says there, it's useful for situations where you don't want an item to break into a new line, but you do want it to respect the width and height. There are going to be times as we look through this that you're going to want to use this. It says an element with display inline block does have a subset of the block things we already know about. So as mentioned, the width and height are respected. The padding, margin, border causes stuff to be pushed away. However, it does not break into a new line. And it will only become larger if the content you explicitly add width and height properties. Okay, so that's what they're showing here. Where this can be useful, as they mentioned, is when you want to give a link a larger area by adding padding to it. All right. And you'll see this kind of thing as an example if you are setting up, maybe this isn't the greatest example they show here, but maybe for a menu or something like that at the top of a page or at the bottom of a page, you want to give something more room, be something where you might use it. Now, there is a test your skills in here. I'm not going to do this, but I would strongly suggest that you go and give it a look. Again, all I can tell you is I'm going through this stuff. I'm spending time doing this, and actually what I'm doing right now, I'm doing it on my own time because it's the weekend. But how much time you spend looking at these, looking at this stuff, spending this, it depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you want to become a web developer, if that is your goal, you better spend a lot of time on this in one way or another. Okay. So next, when I come back, we're going to talk about backgrounds and borders, and that'll be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and afterwards we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more lessons in this section. So I'll be back with that shortly.